Hello everyone, I'm Narmadhaa and I'm going to be talking about managing your creator environment. Now, what exactly is managing your creator environment? In the morning, you've been creating an application, I think a Karen's Cooking School application, and by now you almost have a nearly complete application. I know you are going to be creating some more pages and reports tomorrow and later on today, but as of now, you might have at least 4 forms and a bunch of reports. So now that we have a complete application, what do we do next with this? That's what managing is all about. Managing your creator environment is when you have an entire application already, what would you do to get it out to more people? Because keeping an application in your own account is not going to help you when you are in a business context, when you need to be getting information from it and when you need to make an informed decision based on it. So that's why you need to get your application out to more people, get people to engage with your application, submit information, analyze reports and all that, so that you can make a completely appropriate decision about your information in your application. So how do you get your application out to more people? How do you reach out to more people? That's when you publish your apps. Apps are components in your apps, which could be forms, reports, and pages. So in the morning, Sejal showed you how you can publish a registration form. She showed you one part of one component of your application, and you create a public link that people anywhere on the web can access and submit entries. Now what publishing does is that it creates a public link, like we know, and it lets anyone submit forms. So what that does is that you won't be able to track who is accessing the form, and you won't be able to control what they can do in case you're publishing a report. But in the case of a registration form that you published in the morning, that doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that you don't know who is accessing the form, because in the registration form, Karen would have already asked for a name field. You don't have to verify that it is in fact the person who entered the data. So publishing is used when you want customers and outsiders to enter information into your application. So one way of publishing is the way that Sejal showed you in the morning, but there is also a different way in which you can publish. I am just hopping back into the application, and if you see here, you can see every forms, reports, and pages have a publish option right here. So this is mostly useful when you have already created the application and have a bunch of forms and reports ready to go. We saw that Karen's registration form was great when it was published. She can use it to embed in her website, and then she can also use it to embed in her email campaigns and reach out to more people. But when you need to share or exchange information with people inside your organization or maybe in a business context, then publishing might not be the best way to go about it. The alternative is to share your apps. Now, there are 2 ways of sharing your application in Zoho Creator. The first one is when you need to share with external people who are not part of your company, but who still need to access some kind of information in your application. This way of sharing lets you control who sees what part of your application, and you can also track what they do in your application. What happens when you share a form is that the name of the person entering the information shows up here as added user. When you publish a form, it shows as public. So it's just a differentiation that I wanted to show you. Okay, so the first way of sharing, that is to share with people who are not part of your company, is by sharing individual components of your application, say a bunch of forms or reports, and by selecting the reports and forms and by entering their email address of the person you want to share it with. These people could be your colleagues, could be business partners, interns, or temporary employees in your company. So they are not essentially a part of your company, but they could be. So let's see how exactly this works so that we can understand it a little better. I'm going back into the application and I'm going into settings right here. And if I click on share here, it opens up this screen. It says here that this application is private and it's not shared with anyone as far. So it also shows a list of all the forms and the reports that I have in my application. Now what I can do is I can select a bunch of reports and forms, or let's just say I select an entire module here, and I can enter the email address of the person I want to share it with. Now I'm just going to share it with myself so that we can see how it works. And I'm going to click share. Okay, so it says it's shared. Now if you can see here, this screen opens up and it says shared. If I click on this, it shows who it's shared to. Okay. The second way of sharing is when you need to share your information with people inside your company. This is completely focused to only the people who you work with, your employees most probably. And this is most common when you have more than, say, 30 or 40, even more than that, employees. So it's a more focused way of sharing, and it's also a meticulous way of detailing permissions and what each person can do. When you need to share something within your organization or company, you first need to have the company itself. Now, I don't mean that in a physical sense. I mean that in a creator perspective. In a Zoho creator perspective, to share with people inside your organization, you need to recreate your organization inside Zoho Creator. And by that, I just mean that you need to bring the same people who work for you inside your creator and say, add them as part of your application, give them specific roles and permissions, and then let them access certain parts of your application. So we'll all talk about that one by one instead of just throwing random things here and there. So these are some of the explanations that I found useful when I was putting this presentation together, and you might find it useful as well, I hope. Okay. So the first thing we need to do when we are recreating our organization is to add users. Now I'll go back into the product and see how it works so that it's easier to understand. And I'm here in settings, and I'm going to go to users and permissions. Now what this screen shows is that it shows the users who are currently in my application. So this Karen's cooking class is Karen, the owner of the application. And I can go ahead and click on this button here to add a user. So let me just add myself. I've practiced this so many times that it's come up here automatically. So there it also shows a choose role and a choose profile option. Let's just ignore that for a while and I'll come back to it. And if I say add, it's added me as a user in this organization. So that's how you add people into your organization. And the next thing is to give them roles. Roles are nothing but designations or departments in your company. So the basic roles here are CEO, manager, and employee. So these roles define how your organization or your company is structured, right? So, for example, a manager won't be able to access the information that the CEO has entered into the application. In the same way, the employee won't be able to access the manager's information. So this is a typical organization structure, and it follows the real-world organization structure as well. Now that we have roles here, we can also go ahead and add a new role right here. And I'm just going to say instructor. And this button here is a very interesting button that when enabled, all the instructors in this application will be able to access the information that their other instructors have added. So that's what we mean by share data with peers. I can give a description if I want to, not now, but let's just go ahead and save. And it shows up a summary of the role that I have just created. So now that we have users here and roles here, we need to match these users with their roles. So that is a pretty straightforward step. I can just go here, click on this little drop down, and it pops up all the roles that I have defined in my organization. I can change this as the instructor after confirmation. So that's how you can add users and change their user roles and set it up. So now we have almost covered most of the important aspects of user roles and permissions. Okay, so the next thing is, now that we have users and roles and we've matched them and we've all done it, the next thing we need to focus on is tell each of these user roles what they can and what they can't do with the reports in the application. So when you add a user into the application, they will have access to the whole application. But when you define their own roles and permissions, that's when you limit what they see and what they can't see. So let's see how you can do that. This time I go to the dashboard and I go to reports. Now, because most of the information in the application is stored inside reports, we go to the report and define who sees what in that section. So I'm just going to click on the instructors report here. And here it shows an option called restrict visibility. Now this screen here shows who I restrict in my application and what I restrict them to. So this part here shows who, and this part covers what. So I'm just going to select selected users, and it shows up the users in my organization. And I'm just going to go and select roles because that's what we're talking about. So here it shows up the roles in my organization, and I can select one maybe and add. And now that I have added this, what I have done is I'm going to define roles and permissions for this particular role. This particular role as an instructor, and what they can do in this instructor's report. So that's what I'm going to do. Let me just explain this before we go on. So add record is submit an entry, and edit is after submitting an entry, they can go back and look at it, and if necessary, change or modify it. Delete is explanatory. Export is when they have to download the information or download the records into their computers. Import is again uploading, and bulk edit is when they have to select multiple records and edit them simultaneously. And duplicate record is pretty self-explanatory. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to define permissions for my instructors. By default, they have all the permissions, but I'm just going to uncheck that, and I'm going to say they can add a record and export a record. That's all. And I'm going to save. So now what I have done is I have defined what all the instructors in my application can and cannot do in regard to this instructor's report. So this is intensely focused permissions and user sharing. I don't think most of the companies that have 4 or 5 employees would be using something in this focused manner. But once an company is growing, that is when you might want to think about limiting exactly what your users can and can't do. Okay, so we have one more topic today before I close, and that is called profiles. Now, profiles are a bunch of permissions that you can group together and set or give to certain users or roles in your company. Profiles are based on a form, and they are applicable to all the reports that are associated with a single form. So I'll just show how that works quickly. I go back into settings, users and permissions, and I click on profiles. Now here there are 2 default profiles. One is the administrator and the other is the user. Administrator refers to the owner of the application, and user refers to every user I add as a user. So these profiles are, by the way, are temporary labels, like I said. So you can assign these role profiles to people, and you can also change them whenever you need it. So I'm not going to create a new profile. I'm just going to edit one of these profiles and see how it shows up inside. Of course, I can create a profile right here. I'm going to edit, and this screen here shows specific permissions that each person or each profile can have for individual forms. So these are again very focused and very detailed, and you can either let them access the form or page, let them create new records, view, edit, delete, and of course search is always on by default. So that's how you can create a profile, and you can assign this profile to the different users or roles in your organization. If you come back here, this section is where you can change what profile this person has. Okay, all right. So now there's one thing I quickly skipped up, and I'm going to talk about that. It's called View All and Modify All. Now these two options here that you might not find elsewhere in Zoho Creator. And what these two does is that they have the power to override all role permissions. So when I was talking about roles and building up an organization structure and hierarchy, we said how a senior member or a higher level authority will be able to access all the records of their subordinates, but the subordinates won't be able to access their senior people's records. So in some cases, you might not want that to happen. In some cases, say like in Karen's cooking class, for example, Karen might have a bunch of instructors, say 4 instructors, and all of these instructors can go into the instructors form and fill up information about themselves. But Karen, being the owner of the application, can also include a record and add information about a different instructor. So what that does is that we now have 5 instructors, but only 4 of them can access each other's records. So that's when you might want to use View All. What View All does is that it overrides all roles and structures, and it shows up all the records of everyone who entered the information. So now I know that this is a little too much to take in too little time, so we can all come back and you can ask me anything about this later on, or we can meet with someone else in the team and also discuss about this. So if I save, that's all there is to profiling. So the last thing, promise, is that sometimes you can't always develop an application by yourself. I know we say do it yourself and you can manage it yourself, but sometimes you might need some help. I've had help plenty of times. So what happens then is that you can add a third person into your application, and you can let them develop your application for you. They will have complete access to your application, including the scripting part, and you can let them finish up your application. So let's see how we can do that. If you just go into General Settings here, you can see a small drop-down box here that says Change Developer. If I just click on Change here, it shows up this dialog box where I can enter the email address of a developer and add them as a developer. So I can also add multiple developers, and it'll show up here, and if I do that, it'll show up here, and I can change based on who I want to develop my application. In my session, I spoke about publishing components of your application, and I showed you, and we spoke about the difference between publishing and sharing, and how you can share selected components of your application with people who are not part of your company. That was the first part of sharing. And in the second part, we spoke about creating user roles and permissions and also profiles. And finally, we spoke about how you can add a developer into your application and how you can get help to build your application.